When Anakin was a freshly made Padawan, just a few months after Naboo, he and Obi-Wan had gone on one of their first missions. For one reason or another, it brought them to a particular system with no name but didn't need one to profoundly stay with Anakin for the rest of his life. It was a dead system. It was so impossibly old its very star burned itself out and became a frigid dwarf so cold it hovered a minuscule fraction of a degree above absolute zero. The star died. Stars could die, the same as people or animals. It didn't matter what you were, where you came from, or how powerful you were, time would eventually wear you down and you'd die. One of the most terrifying things Anakin ever learned. Obi-Wan didn't make it any better, quite honestly telling it for what it was, mixing it again with some Jedi philosophy Anakin would grow to quickly tire of until quite recently. It may have been one of the first times Anakin resented his master too. The image of the cold, dead star stuck with him ever since this mission, though he never told this to anyone. Not even Palpatine. This realization of the fragility of everything in the universe sowed fear into Anakin's heart. Fear that only intensified as the years went by. Every time he went into battle, or if there was a chance someone he cared about could die, the fear would creep up on him and make fun of him, always saying that everything eventually dies. Part of Anakin's recklessness was in response to this, to shout back at the voice and prove it wrong by saving as many as he could, but it never disappeared. With the war, this fear became a more constant companion and stoked by his own stupidity, ego, and more than a little manipulation from Palpatine. It might have consumed him had Obi-Wan not opened up and by extension, made Anakin do the same. Since that conversation, the fear of cold death ebbed away and seemed to vanish entirely. As he stared out through the main viewport of the ship taking them to Coruscant, sitting in one of the back seats along with Master Yoda, Anakin was intimately reminded of watching the Dead Star all over again. The capital of the Republic, no, of the Empire, was like an iceberg in the middle of an ocean. The closer their ship got to it, the worse the chill became. The sensation of frosty prickling so intense it actually burned at Anakin's force-enhanced perceptions every time he tried to reach closer to the surface. The smog from before was nothing next to what was present then. Oh, there were lights on Coruscant, countless signs showing that life was very much present on the surface. Life more or less unchanged despite the hectic events of the past few weeks. It didn't make what he felt through the Force any better, quite the opposite actually. The paradoxical life outside and the death colder than the void of space only made it more unnerving. It was only thanks to two things that Anakin was able to keep himself more or less steady, despite his growing discomfort. The connection between him and his family back on Gormo, a beacon against the dark side, and the presence of Master Yoda next to him. Even if the Grand Master himself was troubled by what he sensed too. His wrinkly face was drawn into a look of intense concentration and just a hint of sadness. Anakin wished he could say he didn't know what his Grand Master felt, but that would be a lie. The two of them connected profoundly through the Force during the issue of Order 66, and what Master Yoda felt then must have been just as severe as returning to his home for the past millennia turned against him and the rest of the Jedi. He must have sensed Anakin observing him through the Force, turning in his direction and offering a calming smile. "Worry not, young one. In great danger, we walk to, but alone we are not. We have each other, and our ally is the greatest we could ask for." "I know, Master, I'm just anxious." Understandable, Palpatine was a friend to you, a mentor. Fighting one perceived as such, an easy task, it never is. Even when they were never really your friend? Even then. Real it was for you and adds to the already great burden you bear. "I won't let it get in the way, Master," Anakin promised him with as much certainty as he could. "Palpa Sidious won't use the past against me. I won't let him." "Know this already." "I do," Master Yoda smiled wider. "Much faith in you I have, always." Some time ago, he wouldn't have believed that, but some time ago, Anakin was a complete fool. With his chest feeling lighter than it had moments ago, he took a calming breath and looked back to Coruscant. Their pilot, a member of Kota's militia and one of the general's best flyers, said they'd reach the surface within moments. Thanks to the numerous hidden hyperspace pathways, they were able to circumnavigate past and around security checkpoints and other assorted defenses that would have left them vulnerable to discovery and then attack. The plan was simple: use some places around Coruscant that were known only to the Jedi to park their ship, then they'd infiltrate the Senate Dome. Apparently, it had its fair share of secret pathways as well. means of circumnavigating past enemy defenses before striking at their head. Once this was done, the same people transporting them to Coruscant would fly in with an escape craft and get them out of there before the inevitable chaos of Sidious' assassination spread like wildfire. During the final approach into Coruscant's upper atmosphere, the chill of the dark side swept over Anakin so quickly he instinctively shivered. Master Yoda took it far more stoically, but even his tiny grey hands clenched hard enough for his cane to creak. This wasn't the worst sensation, it was the fact Padme and the children felt. Cut off? No, the connection between them was dimmed. No doubt Sidious didn't want it to interfere again. A momentary panic swept over him before Anakin remembered to lean on Master Yoda, the two drawing strength from one another against the dark power now all around them. They continued to do this even as the ship landed and they flew through the night sky of Coruscant toward the dome and the epicenter of the dark side. Paradoxically, the spot where Sidious was most assuredly at pulsated with a different feeling altogether. A type of cold so intense and simmering it almost seemed to burn inside the maelstrom of the dark side. This paradoxical feeling intensified during their long trek through pipeways, empty corridors, and rooms. He was exactly where they expected him to be, the chamber-holding office, a private sanctum built precisely for the Chancellor, and his closest aides underneath the Grand Convocation Chamber. The place where Anakin was sure Sidious got a good laugh at the expense of him, the Jedi, the ruling body, and everyone else during his long-sorted scheme. Sharing glances, Master Yoda cast his cane aside while Anakin removed his larger robes. Both of them took their lightsabers out but did not ignite them just yet, walking into the CHO with great care, feeling out their surroundings for signs of traps. Sidious sat at a desk at the far side, arms rested against a chair, Sith cloak covering most of his body, even his eyes. But not the lower part of his face, which was twisted into an approximation of a friendly smile. Master Yoda. Anakin, Sidious shouted with anticipation, showing them his palms. Welcome, welcome. This is a most delightful surprise. Let me be the first to wish you happy Empire Day. Not so happy will you be for long. Your reign ends tonight. Sidious chuckled, planting his hands back on the arms of the chair. Oh, I think not, my Jedi friends. The time in which you may have stopped me has already passed. Your precious Republic is already but a sour memory. Perhaps, Master Yoda admitted. Your victory, our failure is, and a great one. However, while a single Jedi remains, never will it be absolute. I am quite aware of this. Sidious' voice dropped imperceptibly. Then his eyes, still shadowed by the cloak, must have looked at Anakin. Then, the shiver that ran down his spine couldn't come for anything else. And I shall correct it in due time, starting with the two of you. You won't kill another Jedi, Anakin said in a mostly steady voice, keeping it together to the best of his abilities. That I can promise you. Such talk, and from you of all people. The Sith Lord shook his head and almost gave Anakin another, this time pitying look from under the cloak. I had such high hopes for you, my boy. To see you stifled under the Jedi, why, I can't imagine a greater waste of one's potential. I'm not your boy, and the days of my listening to your lies are over. Now, get up and fight. Even you don't deserve to die without the chance to defend yourself. Really? Then perhaps I shall simply remain sitting here. Anakin stopped and blinked a few times before Sidious burst out laughing, a deranged cackle intensified by the complete absence of any other sounds in the vacant Senate dome. Ah, you should have seen the look on your face, Anakin. But fear not. I will not trouble your feeble Jedi minds by choosing an action. After all, the Sith Lord smiled wider, showing rows of teeth while from under the shadow of his cloak, blazed two yellow eyes. Laboriously, he drew himself to full height and produced two lightsabers from inside both sleeves. You cannot imagine how long I've waited for this. With distorted snap hisses, his red lightsabers ignited. They produced the same effect Sidious lamps did back in the Chancellor's office, burning so brightly one's eyes strained from looking at them. They even seemed to intensify the shadows around the Sith Lord. Anakin and Master Yoda answered in kind, their own blades standing in the ready positions of Jamso and Ataru. In mere moments, the air around the office became impossibly thin. It was hard to breathe. A pressure appeared which was closer to a gravitational generator going haywire inside a star destroyer over any natural phenomenon. Anakin could almost swear the room and ground shivered ever so slightly, making it appear as though everything but the three of them was vibrating in place. None of them said anything for what felt like an eternity. Sidious elated and eager to fight. Master Yoda, resolved and stoic. Anakin, unnerved but determined to see it all to the end. Once they moved, it was like three blurs of red, green, and blue, and with their clash, came the first of many titanic quakes in the Force to come. Tyrannus was enjoying himself for a great many reasons. The first was the empowerment of the dark side, fueled and nurtured by thousands of years of perpetual mutilation of Mustafar. All of the decades of wear and tear brought by his Jedi and then Sith training were rendered non-existent. He was a young man again, strong, fierce but never reckless. He was a man in control of the universe around him, not subservient to it. This contributed to the second reason he took pleasure with his current situation, the battle itself. Never in all his years of life did Tyrannus perform as he did there, within the hidden almost safe haven of the Separatist leadership. Each strike was quick, absolute in its dedication to defeat his adversary. Each sidestep was graceful. Each feint calculated and expertly woven into the past two categories. The dance of Mikoshi was well underway. Yet Tyrannus could not take credit for it. A fighting style only came to its zenith when used against a worthy adversary, such as Kenobi was at that moment. The Jedi Master Yoda thought he could be was no longer a thought. He was fully realized then and there. No matter what the Sith Lord sent his way, thrust, slash, feint, Kenobi met it with expertise the rest of the Order could only dream of. His Sorisu was absolute, unwavering but more importantly and most commendably, elegant. Nothing went to waste. If Obi-Wan could successfully stave off death for another fraction of a moment, he did so to spectacular effect. There was an ever-present grace and yet simplicity to every action he partook. Tyrannus on several occasions did not even bother to attempt a death blow. He only wished to see what Kenobi would do there and then, by himself, and without Skywalker. Why, if one could observe their battle from the sidelines, one might assume they'd practiced with one another countless times. Marvelous, simply marvelous. I'm glad I'm not disappointing you. Disappointing? Nonsense, Dooku smiled as the two circled one another. I've not enjoyed a duel like this in a very long time. So many in the Order have forgotten the worth of precision, of finesse and forsook both for mad scrambles of acrobatic absurdity. Guilty as charged, Kenobi actually chuckled. And credit to where it is due, I have you to thank for my present skills. Dooku's walk slowed down imperceptibly. Indeed? Indeed. After our duel at Geonosis, I came to realize how inadequate my dueling skills were. If I was to survive against whatever the Clone Wars would throw at me, I would have to do much better. In fact, much of the way I use Sorisu came from my observations of your own dueling skills, Master. A pity Qui-Gon never did the same. Perhaps not. After all, I am also who and what I am today thanks to him. If it were not so, perhaps I would be a lesser man. And perhaps you would be greater. Perhaps, but what is. One cannot change the past, merely accept it, learn, and strive to do better next time. Now, don't spoil this for me with Jedi foolishness, Obi-Wan. Not when I'm enjoying myself so. Tyrannus silenced him with a swift, one-handed thrust. Kenobi did not block it. Instead, he moved just enough to avoid it and attacked for the first time since they'd begun. With a speed the Sith Lord found equal parts dazzling and surprising, he managed to stall Obi-Wan's swing with a momentary block. Kenobi did not press blade to blade, instead, using the momentum he'd built up, swung again, this time for Tyrannus' chest rather than the shoulder. The Count blocked this as well, feeling his single hand strain against Kenobi's offensive. Deciding to take initiative once again, he attacked next, forcing Obi-Wan to the side and performing a series of thrusts and slicing motions with nothing more than his wrist. Instead of blocking or meeting attack with an attack, Kenobi merely danced away from the blows, each one coming furiously, dangerously close to finishing him but never so much as singing the very corners of his robes or hair. Out of nowhere, Obi-Wan broke the attack sequence with a wide, sweeping Shicho motion that was equal parts wild but also controlled. Kenobi didn't just attack to halt his enemies, he observed the patterns of Tyrannus' attacks and waited for the most opportune time to strike. Dooku himself was left standing mid-thrust while Kenobi's blade came closer and closer to his waist. Yet, instead of cutting him down when he could have, Obi-Wan diverted the trajectory of the blade away from a killing stroke. The Sith Lord wasted no time in getting away, concentrating a portion of his energies to his feet and launching himself into the air. By the time he landed at one of the many tactical displayed tables around the control room, Kenobi was already there, performing the same Ataru motion. Momentarily invigorated by this display, the Count smiled, remembering how thoroughly he'd mastered the ins and outs of the form thanks to countless hours sparring with Yoda and Qui-Gon that he waited for the follow-up. Kenobi landing into a crouch and performing a wasteful, ridiculous circle sweep around his entire surroundings to not only strike at the enemy but to cut off any escape. With grim satisfaction, Tyrannus stood his ground and observed the folly to come with rapt anticipation. Kenobi crouched and swung. The Sith Lord merely took a step back, just far enough away for the blade sweep to miss him, and waited for a chance to stab. Then, he struck. Obi-Wan let his feint play out, appearing to leave himself vulnerable by playing into Dooku's knowledge of Ataru and his experiences with Qui-Gon to cloud his judgment. The Force, as ever, guided him to victory, prompting him to simply let go and relax even as the red blade stabbed forward to carve a hole through his chest. Mid-swing, Obi-Wan limply let himself fall to the table in a move few would attempt to. But it worked. Dumbfounded, Dooku stared at the absurdity of what he saw, and it was all the time Obi-Wan needed. With another feint, this time pretending to carve legs apart, he swung and watched with some amusement as Dooku's eyes widened and he took to the air with a spinning leap of pure acrobatic absurdity. With a blast of telekinetic energy, Obi-Wan sent the Count flying across the room mid-flip and right into one of the walls on the eastern side. Then, with a concentrated burst of Ataru, he spun across the table, leapt to his feet, and crossed the same distance. The momentum did the rest, leaving the rest of Obi-Wan's energies free to handle other matters, such as feinting a stab of his own this time. Purposefully aimed to strike a few inches away from Dooku's face, the Jedi Master watched his eyes bulge again and him back away with an aristocratic flourish. He recovered quickly enough to begin his trademark Makoshi dance again. A series of tight, precise motions meant to confuse and intimidate. Obi-Wan's defenses met and rendered the assault meaningless. He let the attacks come for as long as Dooku was able to give them, more and more of his attacks becoming clearer with each passing moment. Because of Obi-Wan's own studies into his tactics, or perhaps Qui-Gon's old master was burning through his reserves of dark side power faster than he thought. Indeed, the only success Dooku managed to acquire by that point was by aiming a kick to Obi-Wan's chest, which the Jedi saw coming and chose instead of meeting or blocking it to simply sidestep away. A curious look passed through Dooku's features. Simultaneously, he looked quite furious at this development, panting quite openly with a scowl and mostly dark look on his face. Yet, there was something else there, something he was fighting not to show. Once Obi-Wan recognized it, he couldn't help but point it out. "Is that pride I see?" Dooku's glare intensified for a moment until he eventually, and begrudgingly smiled. "You continue to surprise me, Obi-Wan. Indeed, you have learned well from myself. And Qui-Gon as well. Our strengths and weaknesses both." He accepted the praise sincerely but not without noticing an undercurrent behind those words. Dooku was up to something. "Indeed, it shames me to resort to measures such as these, but sometimes, even a gentleman must forego proper etiquette." Immediately, the red saber in his right hand struck with a weakened but still impressive speed and ferocity. Yet it was only halfway through the fourth attack that Dooku smiled, purposefully missed, and then leapt away into the air, turning off his weapon entirely. Before he could pursue, the entire battlefield began to change. A series of switches from all about the various control consoles went off, too many for Obi-Wan to keep track of, and with them, two things came to pass. All of the doors and windows throughout the room slammed completely shut in a series of deafeningly swift bangs and crashes. After that, every single light in the room save for the aforementioned buttons and switches lying about and Obi-Wan's own lightsaber died, covering it in total pitch blackness. "Steady now, Padme, steady." All she could do was manage a faint nod, breathing deeply in and out, in and out. She'd been lying on the table for, she couldn't say, but it felt like forever. Lying there, feeling the quickening contractions keep coming. Master T was with her through all of it, using the Force to calm her down more effectively than even the medication did. In truth, most of her pain wasn't even physical. It was something more. The children were rattled for the first time. She could feel it. The fear and worry from them both, the uncertainty of the galaxy they were coming into shaking them more than anything else so far. It was a palpable kind of sensation, one she had to focus so much of her willpower to fight. To let them know it was all going to be okay. That they didn't have to be scared, they were coming to a place with their mother waiting for them and many, many friends. But not their father, who was fighting for them all. So far away, so distant she could barely sense him across the stars, in the pit of the dark side where Coruscant used to be. What little she did feel, ate away at her confidence. Anakin thought he'd seen the speed of lightsaber combat pushed to its limit with Grievous. Though the recently deceased general lacked the Force, the number of sabers at his disposal and the diabolic brilliance behind his design left no wonders in his mind as to who the fastest duelist he'd ever seen was. With dozens of strikes in the span of a single moment between his 6 blades, each single-handed one as strong as a double-handed blow from Anakin himself, Grievous was more of a never-ending blur of motion. A living buzzsaw capable of decimating even some of the best Jedi into pieces. He was nothing next to Sidious. Anakin himself employed his tried and tested methods. A staunch, so offensive, attack then block and finally counterattack using the kinetic energy built up with each motion to press the enemy and batter him down. Master Yoda was a green, living whirlwind, constantly jumping about in Ataru spins and leaps so intricate but also deceptively simple that Anakin wished he could take even a fraction of a moment to enjoy the sheer craft behind it. It wasn't every day one could see the result of 1,000 years of training. Sidious was both of these and then neither one entirely at a moment's notice. He tried to break the Sith Lord's defense with a strong, overhead swing. The kind of blow that would have sent Ventress' blade out of her hand and cut her in half. It was a known weakness of dual-blade fencing, they simply lacked enough raw strength to meet or deliver so-level blows. Sidious didn't so much as flinch, catching the strike with almost no effort. With his free hand, he intercepted Master Yoda's latest acrobatic dervish while his leg went to strike at Anakin's knee. Anakin broke the blade lock and jumped back, only to narrowly duck under Sidious' desk flung across the room at the back of his head with the merest wrist flick. He and Master Yoda dueled alone for a few seconds, moving so fast they seemed to vanish in and out of reality itself to some place Anakin couldn't perceive. Not for the first time, he felt woefully inadequate even being there, which wasn't about to stop him from helping any way he could. Leaping in the fray, Sidious sensed his downward slash and deftly leapt back. Master Yoda was on him first, unleashed a series of low but very close lightsaber slashes directed for the Sith Lord's legs. Anakin went at him from above, opting to deliver a more decisive decapitation. Somehow, even with his arms occupied with defense, Sidious managed to contort his upper body just low enough to avoid the strike. This time, mid-swing and surprised, Anakin had no chance to stop his leg from burying itself into his left kidney. Gritting his teeth to fight back the pain, Anakin fell anyway when something through the Force pushed him down. It was only when the heat of a red saber passed inches away from his ear that he realized Master Yoda saved him. Mid-fall, he managed the difficult task of balancing himself on one hand and pushing off the floor well enough to land back on his feet following a short jump. Sidious had gone on more of an offensive in the brief span of time he was alone with Master Yoda. He was pushing forward with every strike, moving with a speed and precision matching that of the Grand Master. Anakin ran forward, hoping to take advantage of a strike to the back. Without even turning around, Sidious broke the offensive, purposefully aiming just close enough for Master Yoda to raise his saber in defense without actually hitting it, and side-leapt away from Anakin's stab. Using the motion to switch over into a swing, Anakin and then Master Yoda came at him again, and this time, Sidious performed the most unnerving thing he'd done by far. He was moving like Obi-Wan. It was the same level of Sorcerer mastery, now with 2 blades, absolute devotion to defense, a minimalist movement that nevertheless never allowed any harm to come to him. A conscious retreat, letting the enemy burn through their energy reserves while he kept his just fine. Energy reserves that seemed to considerable already. Master Yoda's weren't. However, imperceptibly, Anakin started noticing him slowing down. Ataru was a drain even for young men like him, and Master Yoda was no such thing, and his height meant he had to keep it going. And there was no way he could take Sidious down if Master Yoda was hurt or... No. It was time to try something different. He missed his next attack, letting the motion look clumsy and tired. He missed again, and again, and again, making himself appear as sloppy as possible until the constantly smiling Sith Lord attacked. In an instant, he transformed into a wild blitz of strikes Anakin had no hope of counter-attacking against. He didn't have to, He was pulling an Obi-Wan too and completely ditching attack for defense. Master Yoda took advantage of this, stopping for a fraction of a moment to regather more energy from the Force before jumping back into action to something closer to his initial speed. With Anakin taking the brunt of the blows, staunchly if with less finesse than his master would have and Master Yoda unrelentingly attacking, the two of them managed to deadlock Sidious just long enough for him to slip up for the first time. He overshot his lightsaber's swing and Master Yoda leapt alongside it, spinning his tiny green body and slicing the tip of its emitter clean off. Sidious' yellow eyes blazed in the moment of his retreat, a series of quick and sly body contortions allowing him to emerge unscathed from the lightsaber attacks coming at him. He struck back during a break in the assault, snarling and thrusting both of his hands at them. The effect was immediate and powerful enough that Anakin's whole body seemed to shake from the telekinetic blast. It hurt even worse than the flash of pain coming from the back of his head. Master Yoda took it better, managing to curl himself into ball midair and mitigating the damage, landing on his feet while Anakin lied there. "Well done, Jedi," Sidious's pleased but distorted voice said as the roof of the office opened up and he stood atop the Chancellor Pod's spire. "I was starting to think this contest was already over. I am happy to see that it is not." With a massive leap, he flung himself into the senatorial chamber overhead even as the spire continued rising up. Master Yoda didn't pursue, he went first to Anakin who was still busy trying to get back up. "Are you all right?" "Yeah, I just troubled you are, and sense I can for what reason," Master Yoda said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Your wife, sense her distress you do." Anakin looked at him and nodded. The truth was he'd thrown himself into the fight not simply to stop the Sith, it was to not think about what was going on elsewhere. An old habit he thought he grew out of, but it was easier said than done. Even with the power of the dark side all but severing the connection between them, Anakin knew, deep down, his wife was hurting. Were the children coming? Were they all right? Would he come back to them and find something terrible waiting for him? "We've got to get back, soon." "Yes, we shall. But not before we finish what must be done." With one of the shakiest attempts to calm himself possibly in his life, Anakin refocused as much of his perceptions on Master Yoda as he could, even with the air still crackling, waiting for another spark to light it up. Rising to his feet, he looked at the spire of the Chancellor's pod go up and approached it with Master Yoda at his side. With another glance, the two Jedi gathered their energies and leapt several feet into the air, landing at the very base of the gargantuan senatorial dome. And there, waiting for them at the upper levels was the smiling Sidious. Arms spread out, lightsaber nowhere in sight, the Sith Lord stooped at the edge of one of the countless empty pods and with a single flick of his wrists, detached several of them from their sockets. Anakin and Master Yoda both knew where this was going and the instant the first pod came crashing toward them, they jumped away. One to the left, the other to the right. Both of them leapt from pod to pod as Sidious cackled on, a deranged sound so enhanced by the vacancy of the dome Anakin could swear it was boring into his very brain. The Sith Lord was far from distracted, he struck out at the two of them again and again with deft speed, constantly cutting off one means for them to get up or pushing them down a level. At least, Anakin found himself more pressed. Master Yoda was faring better. Pushing his Ataru skills to their levels, Master Yoda leapt from pod to pod, sometimes crawling under or between two to break Sidious' line of sight long enough to make the next jump. Just 3 sections down, he reignited his lightsaber and prepared to take a final, distance-closing leap when everything went completely wrong. Sidious, as though he saw it coming, swung his right arm, and flung the pod Master Yoda stood on all the way to the other side of the senatorial chamber. Not only did he throw it with a grossly catastrophic speed, but he added the flourish of making it spin around and around as it did so. Then, with a disgusting crunch, the metal pod smashed into another parked far away and Anakin watched as Master Yoda just barely managed to jump out at the last second and sink his claws into the side, holding on for dear life. "Master. Always look out for yourself, first and foremost, Anakin." Snapping back in the direction of Sidious, his eyes widened and saw the shadow of another pod coming right toward him. Anakin knew there was no chance for him to dodge it and so he didn't. Instead, he stood his ground and thrust both hands toward the incoming projectile. Halfway between them, it stopped, caught in their telekinetic push and pull. Despite his smile, the Sith Lord seemed to strain against Anakin's power, not managing to win the contest of strength. Anakin himself was emboldened by this and pushed harder, gritting his teeth so hard he could swear they'd break soon. Then, Sidious' eyes almost blazed enough to glow from under his cloak, and from his fingertips came a torrent of Sith lighting. But not directed at Anakin, at the pod. With a horrible clarity born from his skill with technology, Anakin could see it all happen. The dark power enter into the mechanisms of the pod through a series of holes built into it. He could feel the circuitry inside burst into fire as though it was his own hair doing it. He could feel the heat of the explosion moments before it happened. And even with all of this in mind, even with all his skill in technology, it wasn't enough. Anakin let go of the telekinetic battle too late. Mid-leap and just barely 5 feet away, Sidious' timed bomb went off with such force his whole body reeled from the impact. His back went numb, his ears rang and every pod he hit on the way down hurt worse than the last. By the time he reached the bottom, he was too beaten and dazed to feel anything at all. He lied there, in a state of near unconsciousness, and stared at nothing. Some old reflex kept his mechanical hand moving, looking for his lightsaber, but he couldn't find it. Distantly, he thought Obi-Wan would kill him for that. Eyelids heavy, fatigue, an overwhelming, numbing pain wearing him down, Anakin almost let himself drift off into sleep. Then he heard it, a cry from a hoarse, unmistakable voice and the cackle of deranged maniac followed by the whizzing and whirling of lightsaber blades. Very close by. Finding a new shred of strength within himself, Anakin tried to get up, to force his body to listen to him, to get back into the fight any way he knew how. And it did, in the slowest and most laborious way imaginable. If he had the luxury of time, Anakin would have thought he was lucky he was only beaten and bruised and not left a cripple by the fall. Turning himself to face the floor, Anakin took long, unsteady breaths and through his clouded vision, saw the outlines of Master Yoda and Sidious fighting on. Again, he looked about for his saber and couldn't find it. Only distantly feel it somewhere far below the senatorial chamber. It must have gotten lost in the pipes down there. He briefly wondered if he could actually somehow get to it and return in time to help Master Yoda when he heard the distinct sound of a lightsaber carving through something. With a suddenly horrible clarity, Anakin saw it, Master Yoda's lightsaber cut in half, its owner panting and taking steps away from Sidious while the Sith Lord, smiling and triumphant, loomed over him. From across the 60 feet separating them, Anakin could swear those evil, yellow eyes looked at him a moment before his leg moved like a blur and uppercut Master Yoda across the face. Before he even landed, Sidious grabbed hold of his throat across the Force and proceeded to pound the struggling master onto anything he could see over and over again. With each bang, Anakin tried harder to move, each blow to his teacher hurting so bad he could practically feel it. But he was still too slow. He'd barely gotten his chest off the floor when the noise suddenly stopped, only to be replaced by something far more horrible. Yoda's scream. A burst of Sith lightning exploded from Sidious' hand and slammed him back into the ground, causing Yoda to skid against it with Sidious moving closer. The Grand Master gasped, wheezed, and struggled in the assault, his body so electrocuted his skeleton was becoming visible. But that was nothing next to the sound of it. The cries of pain and misery from one of the greatest men he'd ever met sent a cold chill through Anakin's whole body. Worse than the dark side. Worse than Sidious' very presence. The sheer, horrifying notion that Anakin would see Master Yoda die right in front of him terrified him so much it gave him the incentive he needed to finally move into the lightning. With no lightsaber to use, Anakin simply threw himself there and hoped beyond hope the Force would know what to do for him. His left hand managed something, moving on an instinct unknown to him, forming a small barrier to block off the Sith lightning. His other hand wasn't so lucky. The arm given to him by Dooku could not channel the Force properly. Anakin always had to struggle against an invisible barrier with it, and nothing made this deficiency more clear than the Sith lightning effortlessly cutting its way through it. With the same clarity as with the pod minutes ago, Anakin could imagine the frying of circuitry, the explosion to come, and this time he felt it too. Moments after throwing himself in front of the attack, Anakin's glove burst into the flames, then his arm began to jitter and spasm. Finally, it exploded with such a searing pain it was like a lightsaber crawled up through his stump and burned into his brain. Somehow, his miserable barrier managed to hold, but just barely. He was on his knees, crying and moaning openly from the sheer agony. The strands of Sith lightning slowly but surely burning away at him piece by piece, growing stronger with each one of Sidious' steps. This power could have been yours, Anakin. Sidious, now appearing more like a gargantuan monster than anything resembling a man, shouted through the noise of his own malevolence. But you chose the path of weakness. Now, you will suffer for it. Just as your precious master Yoda did, just as all of your friends and family will too. In due time. Another realization of a different sort then came to Anakin, spurned by his imagination and what Sidious threatened. No, would absolutely do if he failed. Anakin could see it all with horrible clarity, the galaxy fallen, Sidious reigning supreme. Everyone Anakin knew and loved dead. Or worse. He didn't know if this was something from the Force, a vision of what was to come, or merely his own pained, agonizing mind playing a horrible trick on him. But as a feeling of pure, seething anger the likes of which he hadn't sensed in a long time came over him, Anakin very quickly stopped giving a damn. Managing to hold the barrier steadier, Anakin dared to look at Sidious and grew angrier. Angry for how he was winning, how he was smiling and cackling his way through the entire battle, how he was so smug and conceited that he dared to think it was already over. That he'd beaten Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One. Anakin hated him. Deeply, intimately. Hated him more than the Sand Raiders who killed his mother. Hated him more than the war which had torn the galaxy into pieces. Anakin managed to stand, feeling a fresh, invigorating power come over him. Yes, he hated Sidious. And Yoda. The old fool for being too weak to hold his own. He hated Obi-Wan for not being there, wasting time, saving a bastard like Dooku who didn't deserve anything but a saber through the neck. He hated them all, smug, conceited, self-righteous. They'd all condemn him for beating Sidious like this, to hell with them. How else could he win? There was no other way. Even she would look down on him, even his own wife. His wife whose voice appeared in his thoughts. She sounded tired, worried, and happy. Happier than he'd ever heard her before. Anakin didn't need to wonder why. Both of the reasons became clear to him soon after. His children, they'd arrived. That's why Padme had been hurting, the twins were coming and now, they were there. Suddenly, Anakin was no longer on Coruscant. He wasn't fighting Sidious or trying to save Yoda. He was with them. Inside Kota's ship, in the medical bay where a sweating Padme was holding in both hands two of the most precious things he'd ever seen. Luke and Leia. They cried at first, needing to be shushed by their mother until they were together. All four of them in the Force, pure and clear again like they always were. Drawing incredible strength unlike any other from one another. With a restored right hand, Anakin touched the twins and couldn't help but smile when they giggled at him. And as he basked in this feeling, Anakin Skywalker was given a true vision of the future. Standing to the side, observing time and space flow away from him as though he were an observer from a distant galaxy, Anakin saw it all. The Jedi Order, restored and made better than ever. The Republic entering a new golden age, free of tyranny and Sith machinations. He saw Obi-Wan, an older man, smiling in that mild way he did, both hands on the shoulders of two people Anakin recognized immediately. Their children, grown up and happy. And they weren't alone. Faces he thought were gone were there too, along with many, many more he didn't recognize. But he recognized Padme immediately, looking older, with lots of gray in her hair. Proud, smiling but also with just a hint of sadness on her face. And he knew exactly why. Because Anakin wasn't among them and he knew why. This final truth was clear and unmistakably painful, but he only allowed himself a moment to feel sad because this was still only one possible future, one among many, and the moment to decide which one of them would come to pass was still happening. Back on Coruscant, between himself and Sidious. The point which would tip the Force back into balance or send it into a dark chasm. Everything rested on his next move, and Anakin knew it because the Force would help him see it through. If this was what he had to do, help save the galaxy, save his teachers, friends, and family, then there was nothing else for it. He'd get it done. But first, there was something else to do. With a steadiness amidst the growing chaos of lightning, Anakin directed his stump in the direction of Master Yoda. Grand Master, moaning and steadily waking up, was as gentle as a leaf to move away to safety. He was also still strong, forcing himself awake despite his injuries and fatigue. For a moment, Master Yoda sat near one of the lower entrants, back pressed against a wall and expression drowsy and dumbfounded. Anakin gave him a warm smile and then brought down his barrier. He didn't have a chance when it came to blocking Sidious, with one arm, no lightsaber, and nothing but instinctive experience in the deflection. Trying it was useless. But what Anakin could do was let go and embrace the overwhelming energy crashing into and through his body. He didn't feel any pain as he ran into it, he didn't scream or flinch or even slow down. The only thing Anakin did was let the power in and with his remaining hand, grabbed Darth Sidious by the throat. The Sith Lord was so shocked by what happened that he failed to react, and soon, both victim and torturer became two parts of a superconductive loop of Sith lightning perpetually coursing in and out of both of them. Soon enough, they were lifted off the ground as a massive wind of crackling power reverberated in their immediate vicinity, growing more and more powerful with each moment. The Force itself seemed to bend around this focusing point, this cataclysmic convergence of powers unlike any seen in 1,000 years. Sidious tried to break free, but there was nothing he could do. Anakin's grip was tighter than steel and he was already past the point of mere physical agony slowing or stopping him down. It was at this impossibly long moment where Anakin and Sidious were locked in a loop of perpetually building pure Force energy, a veritable time bomb that was impossible to stop. The Sith Lord was afforded a vision of his own future. Immediately, all his decades of plotting, scheming, training, and accumulated power gave way to a crippling fear for his own existence. He would not pass on into the netherworld of the Force, he would not linger on as other Sith Lords have as a malignant entity to poison the galaxy further. No, Sidious would become nothing. For a creature who so thoroughly personified the idea of putting oneself above absolutely everyone and everything else, who along with his master had designs to manipulate life itself, there was no more fitting punishment than absolute oblivion. Such was the fate of Plagueis before him, such was his impending fate as well, such was the will of the Force. And more clearly than ever before, Sidious understood it in all its horrifying implications. He raged, snarled, and tried to fight through the storm even as the second part of it, only hastening his already inevitable demise. The blowback from being incinerated inside out by his own power cast away the visage of Palpatine and revealed the sunk-eyed, malformed grotesquerie of Sidious' true appearance for all to see. His momentary fit gave way to even greater fear, causing the Sith Ari to snivel and beg for a reprieve he wouldn't get. When the accumulated power of the Force finally exploded in an incinerating display of power, Darth Sidious was vaporized instantly, his final howl of abject misery and terror so feeble one would think he died whimpering instead. As for Anakin Skywalker, he peacefully and graciously accepted his death, becoming one with the Force. The dark side coiled about him like a predator, circling about in anticipatory glee until the moment to strike present itself. Indeed, Obi-Wan could see Dooku's plan already working as intended. The thick blackness all around and the heavy stillness accompanying it were broken only by the blue glow and faint hum of his saber. The lack of sight was of no concern, even halfway trained Padawans learned quickly enough to fight without sight, sound, or any number of physical sensations. So long as the Force was around, one needed only it for guidance. This was the brilliance of Dooku's strategy. Mustafar was a ruined world, scared and damaged beyond any hope of repair. It was perpetually seeping out more than simply lava in boundless quantities, it was a nexus of the dark side itself. A planet-sized testament to the most horrible aspects of the wondrous energies connected all life in its intricate tapestry. The Count previously used it to enhance his abilities, and now, when that would no longer work, he let it mask his presence. It permeated through every shadow, choking the filtered air pumped into the station, thickening the blackness, imperceptible pressing against Obi-Wan's entire body in moves meant to slow down and stress out. The dark side shroud also protected Dooku, who, as silent as a creature of the night, was somewhere inside it, moving about with great ease and absolute control. No matter how much Obi-Wan attempted to pierce through the smog, his perceptions were overwhelmed and retreated to only his person. Afraid, Obi-Wan? Dooku's baritone glided through the air with an ominous reverb. The ultimate power, the one you and the rest of them refuse to use, is all around you. It must bring back many fond memories of choking on it on Coruscant. I preferred the Room of 1,000 Fountains myself, Obi-Wan replied, looking for any sign of attack. Far more pleasant than this. Power, as you so call it. It is power, Obi-Wan. Power in its most tangible form. Invigorating to its master, suffocating for its enemy. I shall take your word for it, Master. Personally, I am loath to feel as though I'm stuck on the inside of a factory chimney. Even Dooku's laugh reverberated. Such sharp wit, my friend. I wonder how well it will protect you when the time comes. He did not so much emerge from the shadows as though they seemed to peel off of him mid-leap with the ignition of his lightsaber. Obi-Wan held his ground and managed to block the 3 swipes and single thrust sent his way before the blackness embraced Dooku again and hid him inside. With measured steps, Obi-Wan began to move across the room, remembering where everything was. There was no sound at all save for the hum of an ignited blade and the gentle tapping of his boots against durust steel. Another snap hiss from the shadows came soon after, and this time, Obi-Wan was far more ready to meet it. Dooku himself did not emerge with it, and immediately Obi-Wan prepared himself for trouble. The telekinetically controlled blade came at him with flourishes impossible for any human hand to execute, and it was joined soon enough by one of the tables torn off the ground and flung in his direction. With one hand occupied deflecting the sword swings, Obi-Wan used his other to blast away the table. It was then that Dooku emerged, in the scant moment where Obi-Wan was caught between objects. His boot struck the nose, sending a flash of stinging white pain through Obi-Wan's whole skull and tumbling back to the ground. With an effortless wrist motion, Dooku snatched his weapon from the air and unleashed an offensive barrage that met only feeble resistance. Obi-Wan's efforts were split between trying to restore his balance while also holding off the blade strikes. When he did manage to block and counterattack, Dooku's mostly shadowed, blood-red face revealed a gruesome smile. At that moment, his weapon shrunk to nearly half its length, and Obi-Wan could do little but stare as his own blade cut through nothing but air. With another press of his button, Dooku's returned to full length. It was only an instinctive, last-second roll to the side that saved him from being skewered through the chest. In truth, Obi-Wan escaped the exchange with only a surface-level burns across his upper left shoulder. It was not a proper cut, that would have been far more troublesome, but even Obi-Wan's mild nature couldn't prevent him from flinching and gritting his teeth ever so slightly from the burning sensation. Dooku did not press on, disabling his weapon again and slithering back into darkness. Obi-Wan did not pursue, instead of focusing his breathing in such a way to expel the pain from his body and out into the Force. The practice seemed to elicit a pleased murmur from Dooku. "I can feel it, your pain, your misery. It is a sensation most spiritus. Indulging in it strikes me as unhealthy. You would know otherwise if you simply allowed yourself to try." Obi-Wan did not have to try to know otherwise. The Clone Wars, Naboo, these past few weeks, they had shown him pain in a great many forms. He would never wish even half of those experiences on anyone, much less purposefully inflict them to appease himself. What troubled him the most was Dooku himself. Since the turn of the battle, his previous demeanor was more apparent. There were fewer and fewer cracks in his fighting style and particularly his personality. If Obi-Wan ventured to guess, it was this troublesome dark side smog he'd erected about the room clouding him, pushing his apparent doubts into deep, deep recesses. If he was to complete his mission, this could not be allowed to continue. But how to dispel it? Obi-Wan was under no such illusions to believe he could repel such a miasmic gathering of malignant powers. He could endure, certainly, for a very long time, but this would accomplish nothing but delay one of two inevitabilities, neither of which was acceptable to him. That was when he smiled as a very dangerous, very useful plan bloomed in his mind. It was risky beyond any description, the kind of risk that could end horribly in a simple instant. It was the kind of plan only Anakin could possibly think of and would no doubt enjoy listening about when they reunited. Yes, he would go through with it. The Force would guide him to whatever end lay in store for him. Rising back to his feet, Obi-Wan activated his lightsaber and took a single breath. His whole being was focused on perceiving through the smoke, all of his years of perception and telekinetic training reaching out furtively to their numerous targets. Otherwise, he was completely defenseless. Dooku could strike him down in a moment, and inevitably would, just as the plan required him to. "What is this?" he inquired, amused. "An admission of defeat, I hope?" "Quite the contrary, it is but the prelude to yours." A scoff came from the shadows. "We shall see about that, my young friend." A snap hiss came, followed by the beating of leather boots. There was the hiss of air cut by a lightsaber mere feet away. Dooku would be on him soon, but not soon enough. In those precarious moments between life and death, Obi-Wan smiled and flung both of his hands upward. The wave of focused, small, and numerous telekinetic waves exploded throughout the room. Not aimed at Dooku, but at the numerous buttons and levers situated throughout the multitude of control consoles. The windows flung themselves open, the doors banged rhythmically up and down, The lights turned on and a self-destruct sequence warning initiated. Dooku halted instantaneously and watched around, mouth agape and eyes wide. Obi-Wan merely smiled and leapt back from a poorly swung strike. He watched in those precious few moments as Dooku frantically went about telekinetically pressing a series of buttons across the room, successfully stopping the self-destruct. In the meantime, Obi-Wan did something similar by ripping out the buttons and levers capable of manipulating the lights, closing the windows and doors, and anything else that might give Dooku his previous advantage. Obi-Wan did it just in time to reignite his blade and intercept another blow with ease. "You are mad. I believe the word you're looking for is audacious." Dooku's left eye twitched, he snarled and came in an attack sequence which Obi-Wan parried and blocked entirely. With his free hand, Obi-Wan sent the various removed buttons and levers sprawled throughout the room directly at Dooku. They were just quick and dispersed enough for him to suffer minuscule but attention-diverting hits here and there. More than enough for Obi-Wan to attack, to finally end this battle and cut his lightsaber in half. Then something happened, something very horrible, though he did not fully understand it at first. Even Dooku felt it and froze as well. Somewhere far, far away, a monumental outburst of pure force energy erupted, resonating so profoundly, so absolutely, Obi-Wan felt as though he was stuck in the vacuum of space, at the mercy of an incoming explosion from which nothing could protect him. His whole body shook, his heart skipped a beat and momentarily, his mind entirely blanked out. He even stopped breathing. Even in this numbed state, Obi-Wan's perceptions eventually grasped the full picture. The eruption came from Coruscant, it was the dark side. It was gone from there, gone entirely. He could see the whole world there as though it was in front of him. He allowed himself a relieved smile and laugh. Until his thoughts looked deeper, to the epicenter of it all. Obi-Wan saw Master Yoda there, in the senatorial dome, walking up to a blasted crater with remnants of lightning on the ground. He was alone. When he finally realized, but not accepted, why that was, why Anakin was nowhere in sight and why Master Yoda felt as though someone tore a hole in his chest, Obi-Wan's heart broke. Dooku gasped, blinking and heaving, watching the dark side. Wither away. No, be obliterated into almost nothing. It was not only on Coruscant but everywhere. The power with which they had built the Empire, with which they would have carved this mad galaxy into something worthwhile, at last, was already a worthless shadow of its former self. Because he was dead. Darth Sidious was gone. The fact was so impossible to grasp, Dooku did not even perceive her when he and Kenobi had walked away from one another. He holding himself upright against a nearby console while Dooku's free hand grasped the closest chair for support. This was horrible, it was a catastrophe. What were they to do now? Sidious was the true leader, the true master of the Sith. This changed everything. It put everything into jeopardy. He had to leave Mustafar. He could not die there, too much was on the line. Dooku had tossed aside too much for it to simply come to nothing now. Then, a noise broke his considerations. A sob. It was from Obi-Wan. Staring at Qui-Gon's pupil with a look of abject shock, Dooku realized he was crying, openly and in horrible misery. All of his Jedi training, all of his self-control, all of his humility was shattered. Because Obi-Wan's student was gone, Anakin Skywalker had taken himself down with Sidious in a final gambit to ensure Jedi victory. And Kenobi knew this with horrible clarity. His breathing was ragged, his face already red and streams of tears falling down his face. Looking lost and confused entirely, the only words to come from Obi-Wan were no and Anakin. Dooku stared on, unable to accept this, accept anything. He suddenly felt very weak, very old. Because Obi-Wan reminded him of himself. When he learned what happened to Qui-Gon, and this simple fact caused a compulsion to nearly overtake him. The compulsion for him, Count Dooku of Sereno, Darth Tyrannus, and last of the Sith, to simply walk over to Kenobi and console him. But that would mean the true end of everything. Even more so than dying to Obi-Wan's blade, Dooku understood that such a gesture meant all his efforts were wasted. All he'd cast away in pursuit of this direction was for naught, as flawed and worthless as Obi-Wan claimed it was. All the death and destruction, all the scheming and sacrifices, everything Dooku was these past few years would turn to ash. If he forsook the Sith path, then Dooku would truly cast away his entire life into the trash heap of irrelevancy. The steely anger overtook him, backed by desperation and fear. He couldn't let that come to pass. Too much had transpired, He couldn't change his path, not again. And so, Tyrannus, shaken but unwilling to accept the horrible alternative, attacked Obi-Wan. Kenobi reacted in spite of his turmoil, managed to leap aside, and tumble onto the ground. Yet before the Sith Lord could attack again, he froze. Obi-Wan looked at him strangely, eyes still wet, breathing rasping. It was the look of realization slowly spreading across his features. "My student is dead," Kenobi said in a tone of faint disbelief. "My brother is dead. The boy who was to be Qui-Gon's next apprentice just died." He shook his head and Tyrannus saw something else on his face. The narrowing of his eyes, the slow clenching of his fists. "And you who trained Qui-Gon, who grieved for him, cannot even let me do the same?" Rising, chest heaving up and down as what few remaining tears dried in his eyes, Obi-Wan clenched his lightsaber and scowled in a way that exemplified pure, disbelieving rage. Suddenly, Tyrannus felt a shift occur in the Force, around Kenobi. The translucent being who freely and graciously served as a window into the Force, a being who shone so brightly in it, dimmed more and more. A storm cloud was gathering there. "Are you truly, Obi-Wan said in a low snarl, taking a step forward. "So corrupted, such a broken, contemptible creature that you do not even have the barest shred of empathy? Of even basic decency?" His blue blade swing and Dooku just barely overcame his shock to sidestep away from it as it cleaved through the table. Kenobi did not pull it out. Instead, he stayed there for a moment, keeping the blade down, then slowly got it free by casually severing everything between it and open air. The cold fury in his eyes was paralyzing. Terrifying. Dooku feebly tried to say something, a plea, remark, anything, yet every single word died in his throat by staring at the bloodthirstiness of Obi-Wan Kenobi. His anger was snuffed out, leaving nothing but fear and desperation to drive him, and so he attacked again, over and over again. Kenobi, as ever, withstood it all, his fury not diminishing his Sorisu. The only change was the fact Obi-Wan advanced forward. He never took a step back, he never gave way or halted. He simply kept moving onwards with a deliberate pace. Not slow enough to give the enemy enough time, but not fast enough to end it too quickly. Dooku was pressed more and more with each passing moment. No matter what technique with the lightsaber he tried, Kenobi withstood it effortlessly, his narrowed eyes never leaving Dooku's own, and in doing so, clawing away at his rapidly shrinking confidence. This was not Jedi Sorisu, this was Sorisu by way of Dunmok. An impenetrable defense not made to withstand the enemy so as to buy time for negotiation, appeasements, or simply to wait for a proper striking opportunity. No, this was a show of force. A show of making oneself appear like an unstoppable, impenetrable object. With each strike, Dooku felt his powers wane further and further. Kenobi was barely flicking his wrists anymore to deflect, and his pace began to pick up. Panting and forcing his weary arms to hold fast, Dooku grit his teeth and shouted, releasing a telekinetic blast directly at Obi-Wan, who was only 5 feet away. Kenobi walked through it mid-step, the pounding of his boots against the durasteel sounding like the drums of an ancient, dangerous ritual rapidly ascending to its bloody crescendo. With the wall closing in behind him, Dooku gasped and tried to gather his shreds of power left for one final attack. Something to help him hold Kenobi off before everything became that much worse. Yet when he thrust his fingertips in direction of the enraged Jedi Master, not even sparks came out. Staring at his useless hand, Dooku glanced at Kenobi and saw the beginnings of a predatory snarl on his face, his arms pulling back over his head for a massive blow. It was only some miracle that Dooku was able to block it. For all the good it did. The hammer strike was so powerful he was propelled across the room 20 feet and smashed into a nearby wall with enough force to dent it. His body went numb, his blade slipped from his fingers, and Dooku could do nothing but feebly try to fight against the darkness passing over his eyes. Obi-Wan stood over the unconscious Count, breathing deeply, his chest on fire and his body invigorated but the pure release in the aftermath of his blow. It was unlike anything he'd felt before, so purifying, so rejuvenating. Obi-Wan did nothing for a moment to take it in with a single deep breath. All of it, as much as he could. Because it felt good, and if it stopped or lessened, he would feel things he couldn't bear to. Things no master should ever feel, but they did, because of Palpatine. And Dooku. Because of them, how many Jedi would feel this pain and agony? How many of them would know such profound loss? And for what? The machinations of psychotic murderers and egomaniacs dedicated to bending all to their will? Was that the kind of person the Force wanted him to save? Was that the kind of person worthy of redemption? Obi-Wan knew the answer: no. Dooku would not leave this place alive. If he could not be there to save Anakin, then he would cut this bastard down and ensure his schemes never hurt anyone ever again. With this thought, Obi-Wan walked the final distance to Dooku. With a telekinetic swipe of his hand, he forced a count up, propping him against the nearby wall. Then, he positioned his blade inches from the Count's face, letting its heat hasten the awakening process. He wanted the Sith to be conscious enough to feel the blade carve into his chest. It was nothing less than he deserved. When a groan escaped Dooku's lips and his face instinctively moved away from the saber, Obi-Wan gripped it with both hands and prepared to swing. It would all be over soon enough. All the pain, misery, and anguish this poor galaxy was subjected to would end. The debt of the Sith would be paid in full. Obi-Wan. He stopped and blinked. That voice was familiar. He knew it so well and yet hadn't heard it for a very, very long time. When Obi-Wan realized who it belonged to, he turned around, freezing into a statue at the sight before him. The sight of Qui-Gon Jinn standing there, just a few feet away. He looked almost the same as the last time his students saw him, long graying hair, his full Jedi attire present, and yet he was unmistakably different. He was a glowing, blue, translucent being. An ethereal being of the Force. Master? He smiled and laughed in spite of everything. You have gotten old, Obi-Wan, you're already forgetting the simplest of things. Obi-Wan gulped, shaking his head. He wanted to laugh, he wanted to cry, he wanted to lash out at him, embrace him. He did none of those things but stared on. How can this be? The Force is a great thing, Obi-Wan. Filled with countless mysteries no one being can hope to understand in a single lifetime. It is why some of us are awarded the privilege of another life. Dooku stirred from behind, casting a dark mood to pass over Obi-Wan's face again. Yet before he could do anything about it, Qui-Gon's hand was on his shoulder, translucent and yet unmistakably tangible. He was so shocked by the feeling he could do nothing but stare back at his master, his teacher returned from the netherworld of the Force. This is not what must be done, Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon said in tone all too familiar, the tone he took whenever he spoke for the will of the Force. Killing Dooku will bring you no pleasure, no release, it will only set you on a dark path. Let it go. Let it go. Let it go? He smacked Qui-Gon's hand away or tried to, simply stumbling back. Anakin is dead. He died because of the Sith. Because of everything Sidious and your old master have done. He tried to kill me even as I grieved. How can I possibly let it go? Very easily, Qui-Gon took the shouting in stride, completely unfazed. Do you remember what you told to Anakin when you spoke on the eve of the Coruscant invasion? Our love for those close to us. It is not measured by the amount of revenge we dispel on those who wrong or kill them. The calming effect was immediate, the burning intensity subsiding, but Obi-Wan said nothing. When you lost Siri, you held yourself back for what reason? What stayed your desire for revenge then? I'd truly lose her if I did it. He answered in a low voice, avoiding Qui-Gon's look, opting to focus on the ground. She'd never want me to do such a thing, least of all in her name. And do you think Anakin would? I know he wouldn't. When Qui-Gon's hand rested on his shoulder again, Obi-Wan did not strike back at it. He didn't shout, yell or protest. Even his desire to see Dooku dead ebbed out of him. He didn't want to fight anyone or anything. All he wanted was to go home. Go home to his friends and family and with them mourn as any decent man should after such a loss. I am sorry, Obi-Wan. Thank you, Master. For everything. Dooku stirred again, louder this time. Obi-Wan looked at him, unsure of what to do next. Leave him be, Qui-Gon said, pressing his hand against Obi-Wan's back to guide him out of the room. Are you sure? What if Master Dooku has seen all he needs to? Trust me, and trust in the Force. You have done everything you can. What comes next depends entirely on him. Somehow, Obi-Wan managed to fly back to Gormo, waving a farewell to Qui-Gon, who vanished at the landing pad and leaving the burnt planet of Mustafar behind him. He was tired but couldn't sleep, caught in a strange halfway point between exhaustion and stressfully awake. Too distracted to even be annoyed by flying for a change, he eventually came upon the planet of Gormo, where many of the knights and masters awaited his return. Obi-Wan said nothing to them, and from the look on his face, the message was clear: leave him be, and so they graciously did. Heading to Master Kota's ship, he circumnavigated the length of it until he reached the medical bay. For a moment, he hesitated to go in, of facing in whatever she might say to him. Would she blame him for Anakin's death? For not being there to save him? Somehow, he managed a calming breath and went in, and almost immediately stopped. She was in a bed, looking tired beyond the ability of mere words to describe. Tired but also happy. In both hands, she cradled the sleeping bodies of two magnificent children. Anakin's children, here at last, and so small, so fragile, and yet so strong in the Force already. Their sensation was of a true, purifying sort, not the blinding intoxication of the dark side, but of something else, something more. Gently, Obi-Wan walked over to the side of the bed and looked at them closer. Padme looked up at him, eyes also teary and red from grief. But she didn't blame him, she wasn't angry with him. All she wanted, all the two of them wanted, was someone there at that moment to ease each other's burdens. And so, the two of them, quietly and without disturbing the children, mourned the death of Anakin Skywalker. Dooku dared not enter the temple for 3 months. Not since the duel on Mustafar, since the deaths of Sidious and Skywalker, and since he was given the role of Emperor. It was part of Palpatine's official will, to secure a successor in the event of his untimely passing. A tenuous basis for one of Dooku's reputation over the past decade to ascend to such a position with but one respected enough so far. Begrudgingly as it was. He played the part as well as could be done given his circumstances of late. He held speeches meant to incite a fire in the hearts and minds of the people Dooku himself felt extinguish in him months ago. He dutifully met and coordinated with the newly reorganized Imperial Senate only because concentration on such matters allowed him to escape his issues for a few hours. When he was alone, inside the senatorial dome, Dooku's eyes and thoughts constantly wandered over to the temple. The ruins perpetually on the horizon, calling to him with the same frequency as their very presence seemed to mock him. In the scattered mess of his troubled dreams, his former home loomed even larger, filled with the voices of the dead and the living. All of them calling out to him, waiting for him to enter and join them in their miserable madness. Traitor. Murderer. Failure. These were but a few things the voices called him. Curiously, none of them came from Sidious. Dooku wasn't sure if that made him feel better or worse. Adding to his troubled mind was a burnt-out flesh. The dark side was not with him anymore. The rejuvenating power of it had left him entirely. Drawing on the Force, it all left a bitter taste in his mouth. And so, Dooku was no more a great Jedi Master or a Lord of the Sith. He was merely an old man who required a cane to move about and perpetually, vividly, sensed the wear and tear of decades with every movement. And so passed the last 3 months of his life, until one day he couldn't take it anymore. He gave Pestage and Amedo instructions to cancel whatever appointments he had one morning, ignoring all the pleas for reconsideration. Then, with a detachment of clone troops, Dooku made his way via a personal and well-guarded transport over the Jedi Temple. The clones were thankfully less willing to ignore his commands, even accepting the order to not follow him inside with a droid-like confirmation and nod of their heads. With a rhythmic striking of his cane against the ground so eerily similar to Master Yoda's, Dooku spent the next several hours inside his former home, simply walking and observing as much of the place as he could. A great deal of it was inaccessible, too damaged by the fighting inside and with only minimal work done to remove debris, ruins, and other obstacles. The barest of minimums for search parties and security forces to do their work. Yet even with holes in the walls, ceiling, smashed or overturned pillars, rows of empty data libraries, and vacant apartments, the temple was still eerily familiar to him. The Temple Museum, once a place of countless artifacts and sources of knowledge where Dooku spent many, many hours of his youth, listening to lectures and preparing himself to be the finest Jedi he was certain he was almost completely empty. The various pieces of data, relics, and other assorted items meant to enrich the minds of the young and help the new generations learn from the past looked as though a cabal of thieves had broken in and taken everything of value. Much the same could be said of the archives. The place where Master Nu made her presence known. A kind, approachable one, but also a firebrand who made it perfectly clear that if a Jedi wished to seek knowledge, they must do it for themselves. It was not a service to be done for them. Standing amidst the empty data stacks, blasted chairs, and overturned tables, Dooku could also hear her telling one Padawan or another off. The busts of the lost 20 were gone as well, all but one. Dooku found his in short order and stared at it. Even after abandoning the Jedi and publicly calling them inept, worthless, and a failed institution alongside the Republic before even joining Sidious, they commemorated him there. A sign of how a Jedi could lose his way and an example for future generations to take note of. The fact they'd left it there did not surprise him in the least. Future generations of Jedi would know of him well enough without a mere bust to remind them. Eventually, around midday he ventured to guess, given the color and position of the rays of sun penetrating through the blasted holes and cracks across the entire temple. Dooku's aimless wandering brought him to the Room of 1,000 Fountains. Somehow, against all odds, the 7-story tall greenhouse emerged from the siege unscathed. There was nary a hint of battle inside of it, no matter how closely Dooku looked. Not a single trampled plant, burnt piece of grass. The place was, as ever, a haven of the Force in its purest form. Even Sidious fog could not penetrate it at the height of his power. Dooku walked slowly, taking the natural oxygen in, letting the invigorating calm of the place ease his burdens. There was a pleasant silence there as well, the soft ground muting even the taping of his cane into barely audible thumps. After half an hour of slow but steady walking, Dooku found himself on the 3rd floor, at a crossroads where the stone pathways split up into 6 directions. Even with his Force abilities diminished to nearly nothing, the signature left behind by Master Yoda was unmistakable. His former teacher had been there, one last time. The thought was equal parts comforting and saddening for Dooku, who merely stood there, watching the place in silent resignation. Soon enough, his thoughts wandered to a particular point they hadn't in a long time. Back to his youth and a particular incident with his former friend, Lorian Nod. How they played in this place, practicing with one another, talking about which master would make them their apprentice. Then, Lorian stole the Sith holocron and said the words Dooku would never forget. Not as a Jedi or a Sith. I've seen your heart, and I know how empty it is. A quick remark of embittered spite that profoundly shook Dooku's very idea of loyalty and friendship, poisoning them both forevermore. Lorian was expelled from the Order, not for theft but for trying to pass the blame onto one he called a friend. Dooku never felt any pity for him. Whenever he thought back to the event, he believed himself right. Lorian made his own fate, let himself be guided by jealousy instead of bettering himself or coming to terms with his inferiority. Oh, how many tales Dooku spun, all sounding more true than the last. Now he knew just how much blame was at his own feet. When the time came to reason with his friend, to try and help him, all Dooku could do was cite regulations and espouse Jedi platitudes with no thought or care to how useful they even were. Perhaps, if he was not an empty, heartless creature, he would have been able to help his friend. If not that, he should have learned better lessons from the matter, instead of thinking himself too superior to listen to a freshly expelled Padawan who ultimately knew him better than anyone else. Ultimately, Lorian was right, Dooku's heart was empty. One only needed to look at the temple to see that. An empty heart does not question itself or its actions, Master. Dooku's eyes snapped open. When did he fall asleep or sit down? He could not say, finding himself seated on a bench, hands rested on his cane and a penetrating shock coursing through his whole body. That voice, it could only be Qui-Gon? Yes, it's been a long time, hasn't it, Master? Dooku looked around, frantically searching for the source of the voice to no avail, wondering if he'd finally gone mad. How can this be? An opportunity from the Force, life after the death of the body. The skill to become one with the Force, yet remain conscious of thyself. Eternal life. That which the Sith covet most, yet they can never have it. It is a skill for those who can release themselves into the Force, not place themselves above it. There was no scorn nor judgment in Qui-Gon's voice, yet Dooku felt it anyway, at himself. His hands shook, his throat was as dry as a desert planet, yet his eyes watered. Obi-Wan showing him mercy in spite of everything from the past 3 years, even in the throes of a bloodthirsty rage, already shook Dooku's belief in the Sith supremacy. But, this finally broke it. What more proof did someone need? On one side, Qui-Gon was a man at peace, together with the most wonderful thing in all of existence, one with existence himself, with time, knowledge, and peace of mind at his disposal. On the other, a battered and broken old man who betrayed what truly mattered, a man alone and had only himself to blame for it. You've become such a great Jedi, Qui-Gon, Dooku said, sniffing and bowing his head, resting it against his hands and cane. No, no. You were always a great Jedi, wiser, and kinder than I. I wish I could have seen it sooner. Dooku sobbed then, openly and loudly, unable to stop himself anymore. He cried for the friends and family he directly or indirectly destroyed, and for the student he failed even worse by using his death as the final excuse to execute said betrayals. Then, he even cried for Obi-Wan and Anakin Skywalker, men who Qui-Gon helped shape and suffered terribly at the hands of his master. It is all right, Master. No, no it is not. It will never be all right, Qui-Gon. I've done too much. Destroyed so many lives. All the good I could have done with my wasted life. I chose to squander it. Casting his cane aside, Dooku knelt on tired, aching knees and then bowed his head so deeply his face touched the grass. I am sorry, Qui-Gon. I am so very, very sorry. There is still time, Master. Time to repair what has been broken and set things right. A chance for you to find redemption. I do not deserve it, Qui-Gon, Dooku said so with a burning certainty. Peace, satisfaction, happiness. I am wholly undeserving of enjoying them ever again. The fact that you feel this, Qui-Gon's voice became gentler. This overwhelming sense of guilt, that you understand the depths of your failures and choose to humble yourself in a way I have never seen you do in all the years we've known each other is proof all is not lost for you, Master. Then, he was gone. Dooku knew it to be true through the Force. A part of him wished to beg Qui-Gon to stay but he stopped himself. If his student was elsewhere, then that was where he was needed. Dooku eventually rose to full height, finding his step surer than it had been since Mustafar and leaned far less on his cane. He took one more look about the room and then left, making sure not to leave anything in it disturbed in his wake. It was during his return walk to the clones across the temple that his mind moved away from matters of the past into the future. The Empire would not last, he knew it to be so and desired it. But how it would come to an end, that was still something within his control. He would have to play the role of leader for some time, perhaps as many as 10 more years. However, it was time enough to gather all the evidence required, to ensure it reached the right people and made known through the right means. Evidence of Sith corruption, of Sith manipulations spanning decades to the past. He could not hope to find it all, too much of it died with Sidious, but many of his lingering resources and knowledge were at Dooku's disposal. And there were more than a few individuals he could slowly but surely entrust the leadership of the temporary Empire and New Republic in waiting to. Bail Organa, Mon Mothma, Padme Amidala, and many others. People within positions of power who had true dignity and respect for the freedoms and rights of others. Dooku knew that such a plan of subverting the supposed legacy of Palpatine would be met with outrage and well-deserved indignation. The revelation that the hallowed martyr of the Republic and Empire was the root cause of their pain and misery. With Sidious dead, he would take the brunt of the blame, the Sith's co-conspirator. They would hate him, loathe him, call him traitor, murderer, and failure as a Jedi and as a man. And Dooku was absolutely fine with this. He would accept all of these names, insults, and whatever punishments followed them gracefully and peacefully. It was the absolute very least he could do not to fail Qui-Gon one last time. Feel the Force around you, children, let it guide your hands, let you see beyond sight. Trust in it, and you shall be rewarded. Yes, Battlemaster Kenobi. The group of students said with varying tones of respect, concentration, frustration, and synchronicity within one of the many circles in the main courtyard divided specifically for them. In the months since their arrival to Gormo, the Jedi and militia quickly went about making their new temple as livable as possible. Though quite a few roofs remained with holes for raindrops and unwanted sunlight to enter through, the mad scramble after Order 66 was already greatly subsided. It was one among many thoughts Obi-Wan took comfort in. The other was his new position within the Order. There had been a reshuffling of responsibilities among the remaining Masters and Council members. Master Yoda formally stepped down as Grand Master, passing the title to Shak Ti. The events on Coruscant had taken a great toll on the wise and aged elder. They seemed to age him prematurely, making him walk with greater difficulty than before, confining him to a simple but effective hover chair in the meanwhile. That was not to say his importance was diminished. Master Yoda kept himself busy by teaching students, aiding in the repairs of the temple, and easing Master T's transition to her new leadership position within the Order. When asked by Obi-Wan on his decision of stepping down, Master Yoda gave an honest, insightful, and sad answer. My time nears its end. Played my part I have, the time it is to let the younger, wiser generations shape the Order into something better. Something for the challenges ahead. You did all you could, Master, for all of us. Yes, all I did when more I should have. Obi-Wan accepted this. It was not his place or right to question the guilt Master Yoda plainly felt. He would find the means to make peace with himself on his own terms. And if he ever required their aid, they would gladly give it. The next, possibly most unsurprising reshuffle of responsibilities concerned Obi-Wan. Well, unsurprising for everyone but him, apparently. They asked him to take the responsibility of the deceased Chindralig, to serve as the premier combat instructor for the entire Order. He considered the offer for close to a week, wondering if he could do it. If he could enter back into a mentorship role so soon after Anakin's death, if he was right for it. Then, in the middle of the night, during another lengthy round of musings, Obi-Wan asked himself a question for which he received a faint but definite answer from a source all too familiar to him. Why choose me? Because you're just that good. The following morning, he accepted and threw himself into the role with all the diligence such a responsibility deserved. The effect eased his grief, helped him feel useful again after how dangerously close he skirted to the dark side on Mustafar, and bolstered his sense of hope. For himself, and the rest of the Order. As busy as ever, I see. Turning around, Obi-Wan was not surprised to find Padme approach him with the hover cradle procured by the ever-stealthy Master during one of his first excursions after Sidious's death. As ever, Luke and Leia were radiant, smiling, happy children, watching everything around them with a pure, unspoiled sense of glee. Their tiny hands trying to grasp at anything within reach, Obi-Wan's beard being a favorite. Which is why he kept just a bit of a distance from them as he leaned over and smiled at the twins. They smiled back. Not as busy as you, I suspect. Well, I won't deny I have some sleepless nights. Padme laughed with some genuine mirth. Obi-Wan pretended not to notice the marks under her eyes. Much like with Yoda, he offered comfort and a helping hand when it felt necessary, but it was rarely so. They both found much comfort and respite in the form of children. That, and the fact she too was visited at least once already by a mutual friend. But I'm getting used to it. Plus, it is fun listening to 3PO get overwhelmed most of the time. Luke especially likes making trouble for him. Careful. If he's anything like his father, he'll disassemble the poor droid before he's ready to walk. Padme let out a half-suffering sigh at the thought. Anakin no doubt regaled her of many tales of his droid assembling exploits on Tatooine and the previous temple. So far, Leia did not show quite as much of a proclivity to mechanical matters, opting to spend more time in nature or with her mother, pretending to read books about anything and everything provided for her. You're right, I'll have to keep an eye out for that. Ow! A small, orange Togruta girl yelped as the practice droid struck her in the left wrist, causing her to drop her practice saber. Some of the other children tried to dare a snicker until Obi-Wan gave them a very pointed look not to. I'll leave you to it. Besides, we've already got a playdate with little Corto. Say hello to Quinlan for me. Obi-Wan smiled, wondering just how much trouble the children of Anakin and Quinlan would get into when they grew older. It was terrifying and spectacular to think about in equal measure. But that was something to consider for another time. Now, he had his duty to perform to the young who needed him in the moment at hand. Anakin and Qui-Gon watched the scene from one of the empty balconies of the temple. Obi-Wan, their friend, patiently and carefully grabbing hold of the practice saber and in slow, clear movements showing the Togruta girl how to execute her Sorisu movements. She picked it up after a single try. Padme steered the hover cradle away, smiling at the giggles and laughs of the twins, pointing out what anything that seemed to capture their boundless attention was. Not for the first time, Anakin wished he could be there in person, to share in these events like a father should. Qui-Gon sensed this and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. You'll get the chance to meet. I know, I just wish I could be a more ordinary father for them. But, Anakin let the regret passing into the Force without effort. I gave them something important already, a future. A much, much better one than what could have come to pass. They'll have their own challenges to face, enemies to fight. But they've got all the help they need to see it through to the end. And a great many things they inherited from you and Padme. Qui-Gon smiled, steering him away from the balcony. But come now, my friend. It is time for us to undertake a journey of our own. The true depths of the Force, Anakin said, eyes staring out into something beyond the ability of even the greatest Force users to perceive, all laid out and waiting for him to experience. I never thought I'd have the privilege of seeing it. It can be overwhelming at points. Though, unlike me, you'll have the advantage of a partner at your side to ease things along. That is, a rueful smile graced Qui-Gon's face. If there's a spot on the team for me. Smiling back, Anakin rubbed his chin with his restored right hand and began walking forward. I dunno, guess I'll just have to get us into some trouble first and see how you do. Together, laughing and at peace, the two men vanished from the temple. Vanishing to a world formed by all life across the universe and yet so much very more as well. So far away and yet so close, comforting in its familiarity and dazzling in its stark differences. A world of experiences, sounds, and sensations beyond the capacity of any holonet vid to convey, of any concert to vocalize or any simple writer to put to prose.